In 2002, 4 devout nuns from a secluded monastery in the Colorado highlands set out on a Holy Week pilgrimage and never returned. The church claimed divine will. The authorities found nothing. But 21 years later, a group of student climbers uncovers a sealed stone chamber buried deep within the cliffs, revealing a truth so haunting it would force the Vatican to break its silence. The cold mountain wind howled as their headlamp caught the first glimpse of a hidden door. The fog rolled in heavier than usual that morning, clinging to the pine-covered slopes of the Colorado highlands like a thick, damp curtain. At 5:17 IMM, the bell at St. Magdalena Monastery rang its low, solemn tone, calling the faithful to prayer, as it had done every morning for over a century. But that particular morning, Sister Miriam, the monastery's youngest nun at 24, was not kneeling in the chapel, nor were Sister Beatrice, Sister Alma, or Sister Claire. Their beds were neatly made, their closets closed, but their hiking boots were gone, along with 4 canvas backpacks. The previous evening, Mother Superior Agnes had given reluctant permission for the quartet to leave early for the annual Easter pilgrimage. It was a 12-mile trek up to the old stone cross overlooking the valley, a symbolic ritual of endurance and faith observed every year. The sisters had insisted they'd return by nightfall. The weather forecast had called for clear skies. No one had expected the sudden shift. By midday, the monastery was wrapped in a suffocating fog so dense that the adjacent apple orchard was barely visible. By 6:30 p.m., when the 4 nuns failed to return, concern turned to unease. At 8:00 p.m., 2 brothers from the adjacent Franciscan Retreat Center organized a search party with flashlights and radios, trudging through narrow trails and the dense woodland that bordered the edge of the cliffs. But there was no sign, not a footprint, not a prayer bead, nothing. The forest swallowed them whole. The next morning, the archdiocese was notified. Within 48 hours, the sheriff's office in Dolores County launched a formal missing persons case. Helicopters were dispatched, search dogs combed the area, drones scanned the terrain. But the only sound that answered their calls was the wind through the treetops. Then came the letter. 2 days after the disappearance, a cream-colored envelope arrived at the monastery's mailbox. It was addressed to the Order of St. Magdalena, Colorado. The postmark read, Salida, CO, April 6, 2002. Salida was over 120 miles away, a small mountain town with no direct road access from the route the nuns had planned. Inside the envelope was a single folded sheet of parchment with a handwritten note. No one knew what MEM-BC meant. The handwriting matched Sister Claire's, confirmed by samples from the monastery's archives. The implication was immediate. The nuns had written, or been compelled to write, this after disappearing. But how did the letter end up postmarked so far away, and more importantly, why? The sheriff dismissed it as a hoax, a cruel prank, perhaps sent by someone who had heard of the disappearance on the local news. But Mother Agnes wasn't so sure. She had lived through too many strange coincidences in her decades of service to take this lightly. Claire had always been precise, orderly. The abbreviation wasn't random. Weeks turned into months. No new leads emerged. The case grew colder with each sunrise. By the end of that year, the official stance was that the sisters had likely fallen victim to a tragic accident, perhaps swept off the cliffs during the fog. Yet no bodies were ever recovered. No personal belongings surfaced, even after 3 separate full-scale searches. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them, but the monastery did not forget. Every Easter, a single candle was lit beneath the stone cross on the hill, in their memory. And deep in her heart, Mother Agnes kept the letter sealed in a small wooden box beneath her bed, beside her rosary and the key to the West Wing archives. What few knew was that the monastery kept meticulous records, not just of vows, but of behaviors. A year before their disappearance, all 4 nuns had experienced episodes of spiritual unearthing. Sister Alma had spoken frequently of visions during morning prayer. Sister Miriam had been seen on several occasions staring into the woods for hours. And Claire, always rational, grounded Claire, had once broken a 6-year silence to whisper to Mother Agnes, "If you knew what's buried beneath the western ledge, you wouldn't pray so close to the rocks." Her statement had been dismissed at the time, perhaps a metaphor, perhaps exhaustion. But now, in the light of their vanishing, it lingered like a splinter. It would be 21 years before anyone stood again near the western ledge with fresh eyes and the right question. Not until a team of geology students from Boulder took an ill-advised detour during a summer expedition, stumbling upon a fractured wall of slate that hid something far too man-made. The first thing that didn't add up was the delay. The official report claimed the 4 nuns vanished on April 4, 2002, but the missing persons file, initiated by the Dolores County Sheriff's Department, wasn't opened until April 10th. 6 days. That's how long it took for the monastery to report 4 adult regions where weather can kill in hours. Sheriff Lucius Granger, a by-the-book man with 30 years on the force, immediately raised an eyebrow when he saw the timeline. When pressed, Mother Agnes attributed the delay to spiritual discernment and the belief they were on extended pilgrimage. She insisted it wasn't unusual for the sisters to seek solitude during Holy Week, but Sheriff Granger knew better. In his experience, people waited to report a disappearance for 2 reasons: fear or guilt. When the investigation finally began, deputies were allowed limited access to the monastery grounds. The search teams were met with tight-lipped silence and escorted through the premises by novice brothers who avoided eye contact. The rooms of the missing nuns had already been cleaned, beds stripped, closets emptied, even the candles replaced. Any trace of their presence had been erased with an unsettling efficiency. When Sheriff Granger asked to review their personal effects, Mother Agnes replied that all belongings were donated or returned to their families per church protocol. Granger, a lapsed Catholic himself, didn't buy it. The deeper he probed, the more inconsistencies surfaced. The visitor logs for the monastery's west wing were incomplete. Surveillance footage from the gatehouse had been taped over. Most curious of all was what he discovered when he quietly requested background checks on the 4 missing women. Each of their files contained a red-dagged annotation: status reinstated, previous withdrawal approved. In plain English, it meant every one of them had left the order at least once before returning. That detail had never been mentioned by Mother Agnes or the diocesan representatives. Why? On April 14th, just as Granger was preparing a formal request for subpoena of church records, a black sedan bearing diplomatic plates pulled into the gravel courtyard of the sheriff's office. Out stepped Monsignor Matteo De Luca, an envoy from the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life, a department within the Vatican few lawmen even knew existed. He presented a brief letter with the papal insignia, requesting the immediate cessation of all local investigative actions regarding the matter of the Sisters of St. Magdalena. The investigation, he declared, would be handled internally by ecclesiastical authorities. When Granger protested, citing probable foul play and suspicious circumstances, Monsignor De Luca smiled without warmth and said, "You are welcome to file a complaint with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. But as of now, this is no longer your jurisdiction." The sheriff knew a brick wall when he hit one. The Vatican wasn't just stepping in, they were closing ranks. The next day, 2 agents from the Denver field office of the FBI arrived at the monastery unannounced. They claimed their visit was unrelated to the disappearance and pertained to international communications compliance, but the timing was too perfect. Word on the wire was that one of the nuns, Sister Beatrice, had once been part of a lay activist group in her early 20s, briefly flagged post 9/11 during a sweep for subversive religious rhetoric. The file had been inactive for years, but someone had dug it up again. The agents were stone-faced and efficient. They spent 2 hours speaking with the remaining clergy, took nothing, and left without further comment. Inside the monastery, tension simmered beneath the surface. Mother Agnes maintained a stoic front, but behind closed doors she confided in Father Dominic, the spiritual counselor of the nearby retreat center. "They were chosen," she whispered one night after Vespers, hands trembling around her orrery. "And I should have stopped it, but I was afraid of disobedience." Dominic didn't press her, but his eyes darkened with something between pity and fear. Meanwhile, whispers spread among the novices, rumors that the 4 nuns hadn't left willingly, that they had been part of something called the threshold exercise, a spiritual ordeal designed to push the soul to its limits in isolation. a doctrine allegedly inspired by 4th-century desert mystics, but adapted in secret by a fringe circle within the Church. Officially, no such program existed, but unofficially, archived letters from a 1978 Vatican symposium referenced controlled ascesis and mountain cloisters for elevated discernment. The sealed letter from Sister Clare, postmarked in Salida, was sent to the Vatican 2 weeks after the case was closed. It vanished into the archives, but a copy remained, filed without authorization by a disillusioned parish secretary named Ruth Calderon. Ruth, who had long suspected irregularities in the monastery's practices, made a duplicate and kept it hidden behind a false wall in her filing cabinet. In time, that copy would resurface, but not yet. The story faded from public consciousness, eclipsed by war, scandal, and the endless churn of headlines. Within the monastery, a new generation of sisters took their vows. The old stones whispered their secrets only to those who knew how to listen, and so the fog remained, not just in the valley, but in the records, in the memories, in the very stone walls of St. Magdalena. Until one summer, 2 decades later, when a student geologist named Ava Reynolds leaned against a brittle ledge and felt it give way beneath her hand. Behind that crumbling rock was not more cliff, but a seam in the mountain that was too straight, too precise, a seam that led to a door. Ava Reynolds hadn't expected much when she slipped behind the fallen slab. The ridge above her had been part of an erosion study, and the minor collapse was supposed to be nothing more than a geological fluke. But the way the dust settled, revealing a faint seam, a perfectly straight vertical line running up the rock face, was what made her pause. She called out to her team, 3 other grad students from Boulder University's Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. By the time they gathered with flashlights and cameras, the sun had dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the ledge, but the excitement of a potential cave override kept fatigue at bay. Ava, being the lead on the project, instructed her team to proceed with caution. Dylan, the most experienced climber in the group, brought out a small collapsible chisel and gently tapped along the seam. The stone sounded hollow, not natural. The echoes suggested a cavity beyond, and the surface chipped too easily. This wasn't ancient limestone or granite. It was manufactured. Someone had sealed something deliberately, and not recently. As the artificial layer gave way, a narrow opening appeared, enough for a person to crouch and slide through. They debated for less than a minute before Ava ducked inside, the beam of her headlamp sweeping across what was most certainly not a cave. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust, mold, and old wood. Her breath caught as the light revealed corners, actual corners carved into the rock, not by erosion, but by design. The walls had been reinforced with poured concrete. This wasn't nature. This was construction. She called back to the others, her voice trembling with a mix of thrill and dread. One by one they entered, squeezing through the jagged opening. Their footsteps echoed on the concrete floor, the crunch of old debris underfoot unsettling. The room was roughly 12 feet by 15, with a low ceiling reinforced with age. In one corner sat 4 sleeping bags, worn and flattened by time but still intact, partially unzipped as if vacated in a hurry. Nearby, 4 folded garments, coarse black robes, monastic in design, lay stacked on a rotted wooden crate. Dylan instinctively reached for his phone to document the scene, but Ava stopped him. "Wait," she said softly, scanning the far wall. Something metallic gleamed faintly beneath a thin layer of sediment. It was a small handheld tape recorder, the kind popular in the early 2000s. Its plastic casing had yellowed with time. When she gently shook it, the inner spool clicked faintly. The still held tape. "We need to get this back to campus," Ava murmured, slipping it into her pack with gloved hands. Opposite the recorder, partially tucked beneath one of the sleeping bags, was a Polaroid photo, faded but protected from total ruin by the nylon fabric above it. Dylan retrieved it carefully, holding it under the flashlight beam. The image was blurred on one side, but what was visible made his stomach turn. 4 women stood side by side against a concrete wall, the very one they now faced. They weren't wearing habits or any religious garb. Instead, they were clad in mismatched hiking clothes, hoodies, cargo pants, fleece pullovers, clothes that didn't belong to any formal order. They looked thin, exhausted, yet all 4 were smiling. One held up 2 fingers in a peace sign, another had her hand on her hip, cocked in a pose more rebellious than reverent. The bottom edge of the photo had a faint scribble in blue ink. "Spring begins again. See, Claire?" Ava said aloud, remembering the case file she had read out of morbid curiosity the night before their trip. Sister Claire, one of the 4 women who had vanished 21 years ago in this very region. The coincidence was too jarring to ignore. Jason, the quietest of their group and the one most obsessed with true crime podcasts, muttered, "This is a crime scene, or was, or God, I don't even know." Ava turned slowly in a circle, her light catching one more detail. On the wall above where the photo had been found, someone had carved into the concrete with what looked like a sharp stone or metal edge. The etching read, "I thought faith meant trust, but faith without truth is a prison." None of them spoke for several moments. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, as if the weight of history itself had settled into their lungs. They knew this was bigger than a field report. They were standing inside a piece of missing history, something that had been erased deliberately. The question wasn't just what happened to the women, it was who had brought them here and sealed with such precision. Before they left, Dylan used his camera to document everything: the sleeping bags, the robes, the Polaroid, the recorder, the etching on the wall. They marked the entrance and reinforced it with a temporary safety line for future access. On the hike back, no one said much, but each of them, in their own way, began scouring the internet as soon as they got reception. News archives, missing person reports, church records, and conspiracy forums. The names came up again and again: Sister Claire Dubois, Sister Beatrice Lang, Sister Alma Cruz, Sister Miriam Ellis, and always connected to St. Magdalena Monastery. They arrived at base camp well after midnight, the mountains looming behind them in grim silence. Ava powered up her laptop and inserted fresh batteries into the mini recorder using a converter rig Jason had brought for his drone equipment. The tape whirred, static at first, then a voice crackled through, shaky, feminine, breathless. Day 23. Food is low. Beatrice thinks the door's unlocked, but it's not. It's never unlocked. We were wrong about everything. They knew we'd come. They made us choose. The recording cut to silence. The next voice was steadier, calmer, with a hint of defiance. "We gave up the robes. We gave up the rights. And still they watch. If anyone finds this, take the machine whine." Ava stared at the blinking red light, frozen. The broken tape hissed again when Ava rewound it manually, using a pencil spindle, and played it back through Jason's old Sony cassette adapter. The speaker's low-ground crackle only emphasizing the rawness of the voice that emerged. Female, shaky, and unmistakably afraid. "This is day 7, we think. We're not sure anymore. The sun's gone behind the ledge, and the cold seeps in faster than it did last night. We thought this was a retreat, a spiritual exercise. They said we'd find clarity through stillness, that solitude would bring grace." A pause, stacked solid fuzz, then breathless whispering, barely audible. "But they locked the door, they took the radio. There's no way down. Claire tried climbing out again today, but the rocks give way. It's not natural. None of this is." Then came the scream, sudden, sharp, primal. It cut through the speaker like a knife. Ava dropped the recorder. The others went still. "What the hell was that?" Jason asked, already lunging to grab the device as it continued playing. The scream had turned into a scuffle, followed by muffled shouting. "Don't take her! Alma, don't!" Then silence. Only the mechanical whir of the tape continued, spinning forward into nothingness. They sat in the dark for nearly 5 minutes before Dylan finally stood and said, "That wasn't 20 years of static. That was real." Ava nodded. "That tape hasn't degraded enough to explain what we just heard." The team scrambled to catalog the remaining items they hadn't yet examined from the hidden room, hoping for more context. It was Jason who spotted the corner compartment, a shallow niche carved into the rear wall just above floor level, hidden behind a fake plank screwed into the concrete. It took nearly 20 minutes and 3 different screwdrivers to pry it open without snapping the aged wood. Inside they found a rolled piece of parchment, wrapped in a plastic bread bag, a crude but effective preservation method. Ava unrolled it carefully. The ink was faint but legible. Written in tight, cramped cursive, the journal bore no name, but the handwriting matched the marginal notes in an old religious text Ava had glimpsed in an archive photo of Sister Beatrice's belongings. April 5th, Day 1. We arrived before dawn. They blindfolded us for the last part of the climb so we wouldn't memorize the route. We were told it was part of the vow of surrender, that we were to rely only on instinct, not memory. I should have known something was wrong when they took our Mosleys. She flipped the page. April 8th, Day 4. Claire tried asking about the schedule, when we'd have meals, lessons, scripture reading. They told us this wasn't a structured retreat, it was a threshold challenge. A new discipline. They said silence would bring us answers, but all we've found is more silence. Another page. 10th, Day 6. The supplies are rationed strangely. There are notes in the food packs, quotes from texts I've never read, ones not in the catechism. They mention desert clarity and tests of sovereignty. Alma says she recognizes the phrasing from a banned Jesuit manuscript. Ava frowned. That's impossible. The Jesuits were cleared from that region a century ago. Jason looked up from his laptop. Unless it was a revival, a rogue faction. Dylan interjected. You're saying someone was running a cult inside the church? No one responded. The air itself seemed heavier. Ava kept reading. April 12th, Day 8. The northern wall has a false echo. We knocked on it with the base of a pot, and the sound came back flat on one side, deep on the other. It's hollow, but the opening is sealed. Claire wants to try breaking it tomorrow. I don't know if we should. Miriam's been crying at night. She thinks we've been abandoned. I think she might be right. April 13th, Day 9. They called it intensive discernment. But it's not. It's isolation, psychological deprivation. A test, but of what? Faith? Obedience? We're not saints, we're human. And whatever this is, it's not holy. It's a controlled failure. The final entry. April 14th, Day 10. We found something under the floorboard today, a document sealed in wax, with Latin inscriptions. Claire's translating it now, but I already know what it says. I can feel it. We were never meant to leave. This isn't about control, about how far someone can be pushed before they break. Ava's hands trembled as she laid the parchment down on the fold-out table inside their cabin. Jason photographed every page while Dylan backed up the audio recording to a drive. They didn't speak much for the rest of the night. Each of them sat with their own thoughts, with the weight of words penned by someone who had likely died in the room they had uncovered. Ava, unable to sleep, sat staring at the worn leather satchel that had held the journal. She noticed stitching on the side, faint initials, A.C., Alma Cruz. There was no longer any doubt. When morning came, Ava proposed returning to the ridge to excavate more of the cavity. Something about the hollow wall in the journal matched the strange resonance she had felt when they first entered. Jason hesitated, voicing concerns about safety, but Dylan agreed, his instinct now sharpened by both fear and duty. Back at the ledge by midday, the sky overcast and heavy with the threat of rain, the team rappelled back into the opening, this time with more tools, flashlights, and resolve. Ava moved straight to the northern wall, now partially cleared of debris. She tapped along the concrete until the tone shifted. A section of the wall rang lower than the rest. Jason set down his camera and joined her with the crowbar. Within minutes, they unearthed another seam, a rectangular outline just large enough to be a concealed door. At the same time, Ava and her team began working to breach the concealed panel in the northern wall, thousands of miles away, in a hospice wing of the St. Veronica Convent in rural New Hampshire. An elderly nun named Sister Mary Thomas whispered a request to the attending nurse, her voice barely audible beneath the hum of her oxygen machine. "The trunk," she said, her breath shallow, eyes unfocused. "The one in the attic. Cedar box. Give it to Father Manuel." The nurse, taken aback, nodded out of habit more than understanding and scribbled it down in the margin of the shift report. She didn't realize the significance of what had just been said. Sister Mary Thomas had arrived at St. Veronica's in 2003, claiming reassignment after a breakdown during her final vows in Colorado. Quiet, observant, and unusually reserved, she had never spoken of her past. But on the morning of her death, after 61 years in service, she finally let go of a secret that had festered in her conscience for more than 2 decades. The cedar box, once recovered from the storage crawlspace above the chapel, contained letters tied with a leather strap, 3 cassette tapes, and a yellowing folder labeled in black letters, Threshold Initiative, Internal Use Only, 2002. Directive. Father Manuel, a longtime archivist with ties to the Vatican's Pontifical Commission on Religious Ethics, immediately recognized the seal embossed on the corner of the folder, a defunct emblem used by a dissolved advisory board known as the Commissione Studio sul Silenzio Spirituale, formed in 1984 and quietly shuttered in 1999 after several questionnaires regarding non-sanctioned compensillance exercises. As Manuel began translating the contents, he realized the implications were staggering. The Threshold Initiative, also referred to in shorthand as TCI, was a theological psychological experiment initiated by a Vatican-affiliated think tank based in Rome. The objective was to study the resilience of faith under extreme physical and emotional deprivation. What startled Manuel most, however, was not the initiative itself, but the location of its test phases. One document listed Monte alle Croce, Toscana, 1994, complete, and Pod Lasem, Malopolska, 1997, incomplete. The final entry read, St. Magdalena Monastery, Colorado, USA, malady in March 2002? He traced the signature on the final page. It belonged to Monsignor Paolo D'Angeli, a once prominent Jesuit scholar, excommunicated in 2005 under sealed disciplinary actions. According to church rumor, D'Angeli had attempted to revive medieval mystic practices and proposed modern analogues of desert hermitage trials that had once been voluntary and symbolic. The letter addressed to him from Sister Mary Thomas, written in trembling script, was even more damning. You lied to us. You said it was a fasted retreat. You said we'd be guided back. But you locked us in. You let us rot while calling it sacrifice. I begged you to stop when the second one died. You called it purification. God may forgive you. I cannot. I write this so others will know. Manuel, now visibly shaken, contacted a former colleague in Rome who worked in the digital archives department. Within hours, more fragments began to appear. Redacted emails, internal memos, even scanned field reports from the Polish and Italian trials. They all followed the same formula: select a group of clergy or postulants with prior history of spiritual doubt or reformation, isolate them under the guise of advanced contemplative practice, monitor psychological degradation, and document adaptive behavior. In both the European tests, participants had either left the order entirely or been declared unfit for religious life. One had committed suicide. The Colorado test was marked open-ended, with a projected duration of 40 days, mirroring the biblical symbolism of Christ's fast in the wilderness. But unlike the others, it lacked a documented conclusion. It simply ended with a blank page. Meanwhile, Ava's team successfully dislodged the concealed slab. Behind it lay a second chamber, smaller, more claustrophobic, its air rank with decay. The flashlight beams flickered across rusted hooks on the walls, broken crates, and another crude cot fashioned from wire mesh and burlap. But what truly caught their breath was the writing. Lines of scripture scrawled erratically across the concrete, verses from Psalms, Ecclesiastics, and obscure apocryphal texts. They weren't written in reverence, but in desperation. Some were scratched so deeply into the wall that the concrete had splintered. Ava knelt near the cot and retrieved a rotted journal beneath the frame. Its pages, though damp and brittle, bore more entries. The dates matched those in Alma Cruz's notebook, but this handwriting was different, more fragmented, less organized. It was Claire's. Day 15. Beatrice won't speak. She just stares at the wall. The light makes her flinch. I tried reading from the Gospel of John to comfort her, but she tore the page out and swallowed it. She said we had to internalize the word. I think she's breaking. Day 18. They haven't come. We left signs, paddled rocks in the pattern they taught us. Alma says it's pointless, that the ritual was for us, not them. Miriam prays for release. I pray for reason. Day 21. I watched the moon last night. It looked hollow, like an eye. If they ever open this wall, they'll find what they wanted. Proof, but not redemption. I hope someone reads this and realizes what was done here." Jason filmed the chamber in silence. Dylan knelt near the baseboard, finding a pile of charred cloth, possibly remains of one of the robes. A scorched patch of concrete suggested someone had tried to start a fire, perhaps to signal or maybe to destroy evidence. Ava didn't speak. She stood staring at the wall, at a phrase scratched 3 times into the stone. "We were subjects, not saints." Back in New Hampshire, Father Manuel composed a confidential summary, labeling the Threshold Initiative a spiritual human rights violation, and submitted it directly to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. But within hours of sending the file, his email access was revoked and the submission disappeared from the Vatican servers. He received no reply. As Ava sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor of the second chamber, flipping through the brittle pages of Sister Clare's fragmented journal, she noticed something odd, not just the disjointed thoughts and desperate prayers, but the frequency with which Clare referenced specific numbers. They weren't dates or scripture citations, they appeared in no logical sequence and were often placed in the margins, separated from the text itself. 34-6, 19-1, 112-8. Each set repeated with slight variations, always adjacent to lines from Psalms. At first, Ava assumed they were citations, but when cross-corrected, the verses didn't correlate with the emotional content of the entries. That inconsistency gnawed at her, a subtle itch in the back of her mind, until she remembered the Vatican document Manuel had briefly mentioned in his message the night before the servers went. He had called Claire Dubois unusual for her profile. A convert with a doctorate in clinical psychology from NYU and a decade of work in trauma counseling before entering the order. That detail, buried in footnotes, now surged to the forefront. Ava dug through her own notes and searched for external references, while Jason and Dylan mapped the rest of the newly revealed chamber. Through a sparse online archive of a now-defunct academic journal, she uncovered a 1994 paper by a Dr. C.L. Dubois titled "The Limits of Isolation, Cognitive Disassociation in Controlled Environment." Detailed experiments conducted in sensory reduction tanks and long-term solitude therapy, warning of psychological fragmentation after 20 days without auditory or tactile variation. This wasn't just coincidence. Claire hadn't been trapped, she had volunteered. Her participation in the Threshold Initiative, then, wasn't coerced. She went willingly, as a test subject and a researcher. Which raised a chilling question: had she foreseen what was coming? Back in the chamber, Dylan called Ava over. On the underside of the scorched cot, he had found a rolled parchment, brittle and sealed with candle wax. The seal bore the insignia of the Order of the Immaculate Silence, a fringe contemplative group disbanded in the early 90s. Inside was a draft of a prayer sequence, handwritten in Latin and annotated in English. The structure resembled a liturgical chant, but every line began with a capitalized letter that stood out from the rest of the text. Ava laid it flat and transcribed the sequence. The capital letters, when isolated, spelled a message in English. Beneath the well wall Elijah is Mark hides the entry. Jason stared. What well? What Mark? Who's Elijah? Ava answered without hesitation. Not a person, a reference. Elijah's mark, Old Testament. The prophet hides in a cave, and God's voice is not in the wind, nor in the fire, but in a whisper. She paused, then turned to the wall where Claire had etched the verses. One passage from 1 Kings was underlined twice, and after the fire, a still small voice. They rushed to their topographic maps, overlaying Claire's notations with the terrain they had surveyed over the past week. In one section of the ridge, a dry well had been marked during initial scans, but dismissed as structurally unstable. It sat 40 meters west of the main chamber, obscured by brush and fallen rock. When they reached it, they found the rusted metal of an old pulley system buried beneath ivy. Jason cleared debris while Dylan checked the perimeter for signs of instability. Ava knelt at the lip of the well and shone her flashlight inside. The beam hit a curved surface about 10 feet down, stonework faintly carved with a geometric pattern. A triangle within a circle, and at its center a single capital letter E. Elijah's mark, Ava said aloud. With harnesses secured and anchor points double-curled, Jason lowered Ava first. The descent was slow, the rope groaning slightly under shifting tension. At the base, she found a ledge with enough space to stand and a narrow gap in the wall behind the stonework, just wide enough to crawl through. She called for the others to follow, and together they inched through the stone corridor, which descended sharply for several yards before leveling out into a man-made passageway lined with rough-hewn beams. The air here was colder, staler, untouched for decades. The light from their headlamps flickered against damp walls, revealing more scripture carved in haste, more desperate scribbles. Then, suddenly, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber, lower-ceilinged, domed, with remnants of an altar and rows of rotting wooden benches. This was not a shelter. It was a chapel, underground, hidden. Near the altar, they found what looked like a ledger, its pages sealed between two slabs of glass. Claire's name was at the top of the last entry, beneath it the names of the other 3 nuns. The word "initiated" was stamped in faded red beside each. The next column, "Observed," had a single name written in darker ink. Tylen discovered a side niche, partially collapsed, which contained broken bowls, likely used for communion or ritual fasting, but it was a detail in the floor that caused them all to stop. A hatch, steel, sealed shut, with rusted balls. It bore no markings, no scripture, only the number 40 painted in flaking white paint. Jason looked to Ava. "You don't think?" She simply reached for her crowbar. Jason braced the crowbar against the rusted bolts of the steel hatch as Ava knelt beside him, flashlight wedged between her shoulder and neck, the flickering beam barely illuminating the etched number 40 across the metal. Dylan steadied the grip from above, anchoring the rope around a pillar embedded in the foundation of the hidden chapel. With a creaking groan, the hatch finally gave way, dry, cold, and stale as paper. They paused only long enough to secure a line before descending into the darkness below. The ladder, old but intact, led down nearly 20 feet into a lower-level chamber carved directly into the rock. The room smelled of earth, mildew, and something older, like time itself had settled in layers upon the stone. The space was rectangular, reinforced with wooden beams now splintering with age. On one side stood a wall of niches, each labeled with a small bronze plaque. Ava stepped closer, wiping dust from the first one with her gloved hand. It read, "Claire Dubois, Adobiat in Fide, April MMI." The next, "S. Miriam Ellis, Obiat in Fide, April MMI." She moved to the third, "S. Alma Cruz." The fourth, "S. Alma Cruz." The fourth, "S. Alma Cruz." Each name was followed by the same Latin phrase, "Obiat in fide," meaning died in faith. But there were no remains, no bones, no urns. The recesses behind the plaques were empty. Jason took slow, careful video of each plaque. "They made it look like a crypt," he whispered, voice tight with disbelief. "But there's nothing here, no bodies, no closure, just a performance." Within its drawers were faded paper files, catalog sheets, and a small box labeled Visual Records, Internal. He held it up. "Tapes," he said. "VHS." Jason exhaled sharply. No way, if they stored footage. They returned to the surface with the tapes sealed in a dry bag and made their way back to the base lodge, where Ava had a portable analog-to-digital converter for geological video reviews. As they connected the wires, Ava inserted the first cassette into the adapter and began the digitization process. Static filled the monitor until the image sharpened. A dim corridor, the camera fixed at a high angle, likely a corner of the lower crypt. A timestamp flashed in the bottom corner. December 17th, 2002. That's 9 months after their disappearances. The tape rolled on. For several minutes, the camera remained empty. Then, from the right side of the frame, movement. A figure emerged, barefoot, draped in a shredded tunic. The resolution was poor, but the figure's posture and gait were unmistakably human, deliberate, cautious, exhausted. A few seconds later, another emerged. Then a third, all women, all appearing thin, disoriented, but alive. They didn't speak. They didn't look at the camera. They moved slowly past the corridor, vanishing into the opposite side of the frame. Jason leaned closer. "Pause it," he said. Ava froze the frame as the second woman turned slightly, revealing her face. There was no doubt. Claire. Her hair was cropped short, her eyes wide, mouth slightly parted as if gasping for air. Dylan stared, stunned. "That's not possible. They were declared dead. The plaques, the church—" Ava shook her head slowly. "They weren't dead. They were hidden. Or hiding." She fast-forwarded the footage. No further movement occurred. The next tape bore a new date, December 24th, 2002. 1 week later, the corridor remained still, the footage uneventful, until the final minute. A fourth figure stepped briefly into view, smaller, clutching something wrapped in cloth. The figure paused, looked toward the camera, then reached up and pressed what appeared to be a button near the wall. The screen flickered and went black. Power termination, deliberate. That moment shattered any remaining assumption that this had been an abandoned chamber or a failed experiment. It had been monitored, controlled. They were being watched the entire time. Ava sifted through the remaining documents from the crypt's drawer. A folder contained coded checklists, timestamps, and handwritten notes in Italian. Translated, one sheet read, Subject C initiated vocal resistance, Subject M displays hypothermic tremors. Subject A attempted breach. Subject B recites doctrinal aphorisms hourly. Maintain observation until day 270. Jason whispered, "Claire, Miriam, Alma, Beatrice." They knew. They recorded everything. If cohesion degrades, initiate dispersal protocol, silent extraction, phase H. The implications rang louder than any scream. Someone had removed them. Perhaps 2 died, perhaps none, but 3 had walked out 9 months later, only to vanish again. Dylan pulled out an old floor plan Ava had printed from municipal records. A small cross-section labeled Sub-Basement Access B showed a secondary route from the crypt leading beneath the chapel to a service tunnel, long since decommissioned and sealed from the outside. "They could have left through here," he said. "It connects to the ravine." Ava looked up, her eyes focused but distant me. Or someone came in. The realization hit hard. This wasn't isolation, it was containment, with surveillance, schedules, responses. The entire operation had been designed not to test faith, but to observe breakdown, to document unraveling minds under pressure. It was clinical, merciless. Later that evening, Ava found herself staring at a still image of Claire from the footage. Her gaze in the frame was haunting, not broken, not desperate, but strangely lucid, as if she knew someone someday would be watching. That this, too, was part of the message. After uploading the enhanced still image from the VHS footage of Claire to a secure academic database specializing in biometric verification, Ava received a flagged alert 72 hours later. An unexpected hit came from a private facial recognition tool used by a local journalist collective in Salt Lake City, Utah. The match pointed to a woman named Elizabeth Voss, registered under a Utah driver's license issued in 2009 with no prior history before that year. According to public records, Elizabeth Voss lived quietly in a modest rental property on the outskirts of Ogden, worked as a freelance translator for religious texts, and had never filed taxes under a W-2 employer. Her digital footprint was sparse, deliberate. What struck Ava most was the DMV photo: short, graying hair, soft eyes, high cheekbones. The features were older but unmistakable. Claire Dubois had survived, and she had become Elizabeth Voss. Ava brought the information to Jason and Dylan immediately, and within days they had rented a car and driven across state lines to Utah. It was Jason who approached the small brick house first, posing as a lost traveler needing directions. When the door opened, the woman standing before him froze. For a full 10 seconds, she did not blink. Then, as if remembering a line from a play, she said, "I don't know you," and started to close the door. Jason responded only with a name. "Claire," he whispered. She didn't flinch, but she hesitated. That was enough. The next day they returned, not as strangers, but with truth. They brought documentation, images from the tapes, copies of the crypta documents, even the Vatican folders smuggled from Father Manuel. After a long pause, Elizabeth let them inside. The home was sparse, meticulously clean. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with religious texts, philosophy, and language dictionaries. She sat in silence as Ava laid the papers on the table between them. Only when the VHS still was placed in front of her did she speak. "You found it," she said. "The chamber. The hatch. The ledger. Her voice was calm, void of surprise, as if she had always known this moment would arrive. Over the next 2 hours, she told them her truth, not the church's, not the state's, but hers. Her real name, she confirmed, was Claire Dubois. She had joined the Threshold Initiative voluntarily, motivated by both faith and science. Her background in psychology had made her a prime candidate for what had been described as a sanctioned but highly secretive Vatican ethics commission. She admitted she had doubts, even before the doors closed, but it wasn't until day 15 that she realized what they were actually inside. Not a monastery of testing, but a prison of observation. "We were watched," she said, "every moment, every breath." When Ava asked how she had gotten out, Claire, or Elizabeth, paused. "There was an offer," she said, "night rescue, a transaction. One night, a man came through the lower access tunnel. He had no collar, no cross. He didn't give his name. He told me they would let me go, but only me, and only if I agreed to disappear. No contact, no exposure, no closure. I signed a blank document and walked out with nothing. I don't know what happened to the others after that night." Jason pressed. "Why you—" Elizabeth didn't blink. "Because I didn't break," she said simply. "They wanted to see how far someone could endure isolation, control, deprivation, without losing moral reasoning. I knew I was part of the experiment. I knew what was real. That made me dangerous to the narrative." Ava asked why she never went to the press, to the authorities. Elizabeth leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. "Because they would make me disappear again," she said. "Because the church has more reach than most governments. And because I couldn't live knowing the other 3 might still be down there. Or worse, be used again." Ava mentioned the footage, 3 figures walking out, one pressing the kill switch on the camera. Elizabeth nodded. "Miriam," she said. "She was the one who tried to burn the journals. She was the one who believed silence was sacred. But when she turned off the feed, that was rebellion. That was her saying no." Dylan asked if she knew what happened to Alma and Beatrice. Elizabeth lowered her eyes. "No," she said softly. "But if they made it out, they didn't use their name." Ava pulled out the Polaroid they had found in the first chamber. Elizabeth smiled faintly. "That was day 3, she said. "We thought it was a retreat. Look at our faces, still hopeful, still stupid." Her voice didn't crack. It carried a quiet strength, the sound of someone who had bled and healed and bled again. Jason asked the final question. "Why now? Why speak to us?" Elizabeth answered without hesitation. "Because you came looking, because you found the tapes, and because it's not over." That night, she handed Ava a small red-bound prayer book, frayed at the edges, worn soft by use. Inside the cover was a symbol, triangle within a circle, and a page bookmarked with a single line underlined in pencil. "He who sees the mountain from beneath will understand why silence is never empty." The metaphor was obvious, but the phrasing felt specific, measured, like another code. When she flipped to the back cover, she saw a stitched seam. Jason gently opened it with a scalpel. Inside was a microfilm cartridge, sealed in plastic. Elizabeth spoke one final sentence as they packed to leave. "You're not the first to find us," she said, "but you might be the last to get out alive." The drive back to Colorado from Utah was filled with silence, the kind not born from discomfort, but from the overwhelming weight of everything Ava, Jason, and Dylan had heard. Elizabeth's voice still echoed in Ava's ears, especially that final, chilling line. "She's not the first, they might be the last." The microfilm cartridge, now carefully secured in a padded container, had become their sole focus. Upon arrival at the university's lab, Ava used a digitizing scope to project the reel onto a high-resolution scanner, frame by frame. What emerged was not just another set of journal pages or encoded scripture, but a full internal briefing marked Confraterminata pro Cocinera at Provato 1997, Revocato 1999. The Hermit Project, Brotherhood of the Black Cross. Approved 1997, revoked 1999. A logo in the corner matched the faded stamp on the files from the chapel crypt, an interlocked C and B overlaid with a downward-pointing cross. The document was in Italian, but Ava's linguistic training allowed her to grasp it quickly. The contents laid out a comprehensive proposal for a spiritual threshold study conducted under the guise of monastic retreat, with key metrics focused on moral endurance, obedience to accept divine silence as divine presence. More disturbingly, the name of the project sponsor was not the Vatican directly, but a subsect listed as Ordine Silente del Sangue, the Silent Order of Blood, a cloistered group of clerics known for their radical asceticism and rejection of modern ecclesial reform. Ava dug further, connecting a line of archived papal decrees from 1999, buried in Latin footnotes and never translated for public release. One line struck her cold. Eager to the fatal outcome of the Toscana Association Protocol, all operations linked to the OSS are hereby suspended indefinitely. The Toscana Protocol, confirmed through cross-record sessions with Italian civil records, had led to the death of 2 postulants during an unauthorized isolation retreat in Monte della Croce. Their deaths, reported as dehydration and acute delirium, had been quietly written off as accidents of faith. Back in her room that night, Ava reviewed the microfilm again, focusing on a single page with a name that stopped her breath. Paolo De Angeli, listed as project lead for all 3 test sites, Italy, Poland, and Colorado. Despite his formal excommunication in 2005, he remained listed as Consular Spirituality External, External Spirituality Advisor. So he didn't just lead it, he built it. Ava nodded, and the church let him. When they shared this with Elizabeth via secure video call, her reaction was solemn but not surprised. "I told you," she said. "It wasn't about endurance. It was about worship without reward, suffering without promise." They wanted to know who could be left in total abandonment and still believe. Jason asked what they were hoping to prove. Elizabeth leaned in toward the camera. "That faith can be weaponized," she said. "That obedience can be absolute if you strip everything else away. Companionship, logic, hope." They weren't testing devotion. They were engineering subjugation, the kind that makes you kneel not out of reverence, but necessity. Ava brought up the OSS and the fatal 1999 trial. Elizabeth confirmed it. That was the first time it went public. The girls died before day 20. But the Brotherhood claimed it validated their theory that death in silence is still sacred if the soul remains faithful. The Vatican shut it down in Novalin. What happened in Colorado, that was them going rogue. When Ava asked if the Vatican was still involved, post-1999, Elizabeth was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "Not officially, but remember the church is not one voice, it's many, some progressive, some primitive." The ones backing this? They believed they were preserving something ancient, something purer than the sanitized theology of today. Jason pushed further. "Why didn't anyone stop them?" Elizabeth gave a sad smile. "Because it worked," she said. "We stayed, we prayed, we didn't rebel, not at first. We internalized the suffering, and when the cameras rolled, when the records were filed, they could say, 'See, they endured,' and the few who didn't disappeared into silence." Dylan, having remained silent through most of the call, finally asked, "Why are you still alive?" Elizabeth looked straight through the screen. "Because I saw it for what it was. Not divine, not demonic, just human cruelty wrapped in incense and scripture. And I agreed to leave before I forgot that." After the call ended, Ava knew there was one final place they had to go, the monastery itself. Not the hidden chambers, not the tunnels, but the archive. The ones Vatican officials had blocked 21 years ago. She reached out to Father Manuel, who agreed to meet them near St. Magdalena with whatever remaining access he could manage. Upon their arrival, he led them into the Undercroft Library, a room beneath the main hall, long unused, still heavy with the scent of wax and dust. He handed Ava a single brass key and gestured to a cabinet labeled. Inside were red folders, each stamped with the same downward-pointing cross. One bore a handwritten tag, "Threshold Archive, 2002." Eva opened it slowly, revealing photos, some of Claire, Alma, Beatrice, and Miriam in the early days of the retreat. Others showing the preparation of the rooms, the food packs, the scripts used by silent monitors. But one image chilled her to her core. It showed a fifth woman, older, observing through a hidden camera lens. A note beneath read, "Supervisor, Mater Veronica." Jason whispered. There was a fifth, Ava stared at the photo. She'd seen that face before. Ava didn't need to be told who Mater Veronica was. The woman in the photo was the same Sister Superior who had been quietly reassigned to an obscure abbey in northern France in late 2003, under the pretense of health leave. The same woman whose name had appeared briefly in a Vatican memo tied to the Office of Consecrated Life, and who, according to Father Manuel, had been one of the most devout traditionalists within the old OSS circle. She had overseen the Threshold Initiative in Colorado from a distance, never setting foot in the chambers herself, but monitoring every tape, every record, every whispered prayer transmitted through one-way microphones. Her presence confirmed that the entire operation had maintained central oversight, and it also meant that someone still alive held administrative accountability. Armed with undeniable documentation, Ava and Jason contacted an independent investigative journalist from ProPublica, who had previously exposed a major abuse cover-up within a Catholic seminary in South America. The journalist, a seasoned veteran named Camille Hartley, immediately grasped the gravity of the material and agreed to collaborate on a long-form documentary. Meanwhile, Dylan and a group of university-affiliated geologists returned to the site, this time accompanied by forensic anthropologists. It took 3 days of excavation beneath the second crypt to locate the buried chamber referenced in Elizabeth's journal, marked with only faint cross symbols and collapsed timber beams. When they removed the final stone slab, what they found ended all speculation. 2 skeletons, interred side by side, still wrapped in the remnants of fabric robes and rope-bound at the wrists. Dental records later confirmed the identities: Sister Beatrice Lang and Sister Miriam Ellis. The autopsy reports concluded death by dehydration and systemic collapse. Consistent with prolonged exposure and starvation, there were no signs of trauma, no defenses to prevent, and alone in the dark. Ava wept when she read the report, not from shock, but from the crushing finality of what it confirmed. 2 had died in silence, buried not in honor, but in shame, their bodies hidden to preserve a lie. Camille's documentary team filmed everything: the discovery, the interviews with Elizabeth, the recovered files, the confession tapes, and even Ava's own journals as she pieced the truth together. The narrative unfolded like a psychological thriller, but the pain beneath it was real. The premiere was held in New York under the title Faith in Silence, and within days, excerpts had gone viral across Europe and Latin America. The Vatican responded within a week. For the first time in decades, a formal statement was released from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, acknowledging the existence of the Threshold Initiative and its connection to rogue elements within the disbanded OSS. The statement admitted grave errors in oversight, confirmed the identities of the deceased, and expressed profound sorrow for the lives lost and the trauma endured. It also included a landmark declaration: all programs resembling the Threshold Initiative would be permanently banned under canonical law, and any remaining members of the OSS-affiliated networks were to be placed under investigation, stripped of clerical privilege, and removed from any pastoral authority. The Order of St. Magdalena was formally dissolved 6 months later. The property was handed over to the state and designated as a historical site pending transformation into a memorial center. The chambers, tunnels, and crypts were preserved under glass, with recorded testimonies from survivors and experts available for visitors. Ava returned one final time, standing before the altar in the underground chapel, now lit by a single shaft of sunlight that had been cut through the stone dome above. She placed a rosary at the base of the plaque bearing the names of all 4 women: Claire, Alma, Beatrice, and Miriam, even though only 2 had died. Elizabeth, now living under witness protection, had asked her to do it. As Ava whispered a final prayer, she felt no vengeance, no lingering fury, only clarity. She had followed the echo of silence through every hidden door, every suppressed document, every buried truth. And in doing so, she had given voice to the ones left behind. Claire Dubois, presumed dead in 2002, was granted legal resurrection in 2026 through federal order. She declined public appearances, choosing instead to consult privately on ethical oversight for psychological research. Her life, fractured and rebuilt, became the quiet rebuke to the very ideology that once tried to erase her. Jason returned to filmmaking, creating a follow-up project that focused on spiritual trauma and institutional control, while Dylan completed his thesis, shifting focus from tectonic erosion to structural metaphors in human systems of belief. The Threshold Initiative was over, no longer a myth, no longer a whispered failure buried beneath stone. It stood now as evidence of manipulation, of endurance, of the cost of blind obedience, and of the power of one voice carried through the silence, finally heard. If this story left you thinking, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps us bring more hidden truths to light. What part of the story shocked you the most? Do you think Claire made the right choice in staying silent for so long? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let's talk.